In the spring of 2011, a 69-year-old widow in Cimarron County, Oklahoma, started planting cedar seedlings along the west edge of her wheat field, the same seedlings every farmer on the road sprayed herbicide to kill. Every morning that March, she drove the county road in her husband's truck with the windows down, stopping at every ditch and fence row where eastern red cedars had volunteered from seed. She dug each one carefully, wrapped the roots in a wet rag, and laid them in the truck bed the way you lay something down that you intend to keep. By the time she got home, she had 10 or 15. Small enough to fit in a shoebox, wild enough that no nursery would sell them. She planted them in 5 rows along the west edge of her wheat field, spaced 10 feet apart, facing the direction the wind came from every day of the year. The neighbors saw her do it. They saw a 69-year-old widow digging up the one tree every wheat farmer in the Oklahoma panhandle spends money to kill and planting it on purpose, in rows on 320 acres of dryland wheat where every drop of moisture counts. "She's planting cedars," Curtis Hamblin said to his wife that evening, "the way you report something you have witnessed and cannot explain. On wheat land, on purpose. Trees steal water," another neighbor said at the co-op. "Every drop a cedar drinks is a drop her wheat doesn't get." Martha Colton did not explain when her daughter called from Oklahoma City and asked what she was doing. Martha said she was finishing something. She did not say what. She did not say whose idea it had been. Nobody on that road understood why a 69-year-old widow was planting trees that steal water on wheat land. 4 years later, when the wind came, they understood. If stories of widows who plant what others poison, trees that stand between wheat and wind, and the kind of patience that takes 4 years to prove itself means something to you, subscribe and stay with us. Tell us where you're watching from. We read everyone. Martha Colton married Earl in 1971, and they moved onto 320 acres of Panhandle, Oklahoma that same summer. The land was flat in a way that people who have never seen the Panhandle cannot imagine. No hills, no ridges, no trees, nothing between the ground and the sky except wheat and wind and the thin line where they meet at the horizon. Cimarron County sits at the western tip of Oklahoma, pressed against Kansas to the north and New Mexico to the west. It is the place where the Dust Bowl was born. On April 14th, 1935, Black Sunday, a wall of dirt 2,000 feet high rolled across this land and turned noon into midnight. Families stuffed wet towels under doors and still choked. Cattle suffocated in the fields. The topsoil that had taken 10,000 years to build left in an afternoon. Earl knew this history the way everyone in Cimarron County knows it, not from books, but from grandparents who lived it. His mother survived Black Sunday in a cellar with a wet cloth over her face. She never forgot. She kept a poster rolled behind the feed bin in the barn, a USTA Forest Service poster from 1935 that said things the county had since decided to ignore. Earl farmed wheat and grain sorghum the way his father had farmed them, dry land, no irrigation, planting in October and harvesting in June, praying for 18 inches of rain and getting 14. The wind was constant. It blew from the southwest 9 months out of 12, steady and warm and dry, pressing against everything that stood and carrying away everything that didn't. Every fall, Earl said the same thing. "The wind's going to take everything someday if we don't plant something to stop it," he said it, the way men say things they believe but are not yet willing to act on out loud. To no one in particular, while looking west, he never planted. The neighbors would have talked. Cedars steal water. Every acre given to trees is an acre not earning, and 320 acres was already not quite enough. On May 11, 2009, an EF2 tornado crossed the county line and found Earl closing the barn door against the wind. The barn lifted. Earl did not. Martha buried him on the hill east of the house where you can see all 320 acres at once. She did not cry at the service. She stood at the grave afterward and looked west, the way Earl used to look, and felt the wind press against her face the way it had pressed against his every morning for 38 years. She sold the equipment she could not operate alone. She leased 200 acres to a neighbor for wheat. She kept 120 to manage herself, and one afternoon, while sorting Earl's things in the barn his mother had used, the barn the tornado had not touched, she found a poster rolled behind the feed bin, tied with baling twine, covered in 40 years of dust. She unrolled it on the kitchen table that evening. The paper was yellow and soft at the edges. The ink had faded, but the words were still clear. "Plant trees, stop dust, save farms." Below the headline was a drawing, simple, direct, the kind of illustration made for farmers who did not have time to read long explanations. A row of trees on the left, arrows showing wind hitting the trees. Rising over the top and descending gently on the other side, a sheltered zone behind the trees where the arrows were short and soft, and in that zone, wheat standing straight while the wheat beyond the shelter lay flat. A single line of text beneath the drawing: windbreaks reduce wind speed 50–70% for a distance of 10 to 20 times the height of the trees. The poster was from Roosevelt's Prairie States Forestry Project, the program that planted 220 million trees across the Great Plains between 1934 and 1942 to stop the dust storms that had nearly killed the region. 18,600 miles of shelter belts, stretching from the Dakotas to Texas, the largest tree planting effort in American history, built in response to the very wind that had crossed Earl's land every day of his life. Earl's mother had kept the poster because she remembered what the wind could do when nothing stood in its way. She had seen Black Sunday. She had breathed through a wet cloth in a cellar. She knew. Martha looked at the drawing for a long time. 10 trees, roughly sketched, wind arrows bending over them, wheat standing behind them. The math was simple enough for a poster and simple enough for a 69-year-old woman sitting alone at a kitchen table where her husband used to sit. She turned the poster over. On the back, in pencil, in handwriting she did not recognize Earl's mother's, maybe, or someone older, were 2 words. It works. She thought about Earl. Every fall, the same sentence. The wind's going to take everything someday if we don't plant something to stop it. He had known. His mother had known. The poster had known since 1935. Nobody planted. Martha knew where the cedars grew. Every ditch, every fence row, every place the herbicide missed. She had driven past them for 38 years. She went to the barn and found a shovel. The first row nearly failed before it started. She planted 40 cedars along the west edge in the second week of March, small seedlings, 12 to 18 inches tall, dug from the ditch along Route 56 where nobody sprayed because nobody cared. She planted them 8 inches deep in the sandy panhandle soil and tamped the dirt around each stem with her boot. 2 weeks later, a sustained southwest wind 40 miles per hour. Ordinary for Cimarron County in spring pulled 24 of them out of the ground. She found them lying on their sides with their roots in the air, as if the wind had simply reached down and picked them up. 60% of the first row, gone before the stems had thickened enough to resist. She drove to the barn and sat in the truck for a while. Then she replanted, deeper this time, 14 inches instead of 8. She packed wet mulch around each base, wedged small stones against the windward side of each stem, and watered twice. She waited until mid-April, when the spring winds eased, to plant the remaining 4 rows. They held. Then Curtis's herbicide arrived. Curtis Hamblin farmed 400 acres to the south. Every spring he sprayed the cedar volunteers along his fence line, standard practice. County approved, what every responsible wheat farmer in the panhandle did to keep invasive trees from stealing moisture. In late April, on a day the wind was blowing north instead of east, the spray drifted. 8 cedars in Martha's 5th row, the row closest to the property line, turned yellow within a week. 5 of them died. Curtis came to the fence. He was not a cruel man. "Martha, I'm sorry about the trees. Drift happens, but cedars are weeds out here. You know that." She looked at him the way she looked at most things, steadily, without argument. She did not explain. She replanted the 5 dead cedars and moved the entire 5th row 15 feet inward. The road had opinions. Trees steal water. Every drop a cedar drinks is a drop her wheat doesn't get. Her husband farmed this land 40 years without trees. If Earl didn't plant them, why should she? "Martha, the county extension says cedars are invasive. You're planting an invasive species on purpose." The middle sentence was the one that stayed with her. Earl did not plant them. That was true, but Earl did not plant them because he ran out of time, not because he ran out of belief. The wind that everyone used as evidence that trees were unnecessary was the same wind that had killed him. By the 3rd spring, the cedars were 7 feet tall. They leaned slightly east, shaped by the same west wind they were learning to resist. Martha stood on the east side of the tree line one afternoon when the wind was blowing 35 miles per hour. She could feel the difference on her face. The air was calmer, quieter. The wheat behind the cedars was standing straighter than the wheat 200 yards east. Beyond the sheltered zone, she wrote in Earl's old farm journal that night, in handwriting that looked nothing like his: "Wind slower behind trees, wheat standing taller. Year 3. The derecho arrived on a June afternoon the way derechos arrive on the panhandle, with a wall of dust on the horizon that looked like a second ground rising to meet the sky. Straight line wind. Not a tornado, wider, flatter, impossible to dodge. 80 miles per hour across the entire county for 22 minutes, long enough to end a wheat season. Curtis Hamblin's 400 acres took it full. His wheat was 2 weeks from harvest, tall, heavy-headed, the stalks rigid with the weight of a good year. 80-mile-per-hour wind does not bend heavy wheat, it snaps it. The stalks broke at the base. One row toppling into the next like dominoes, falling in every direction at once. When the wind stopped, 60% of his field was flat, the heads lying on the ground below the combine's cutter bar. Unharvestable $40,000 of wheat, mature and ready, lying in the dirt. 2 other farms on the road lost the same way, same wind, same speed, same flat, open, treeless ground with nothing between the wheat and whatever the sky decided to throw at it. The Panhandle had not seen wind damage this severe since the straight-line storms of the early 90s. Martha's 320 acres sat in the same wind, under the same sky, on the same afternoon, the 5 rows of eastern red cedar, 4 years old now, 10 feet tall. Leaning slightly east from a lifetime of leaning into what they were planted to resist, stood along the west edge and took the first impact. The wind hit the cedars and did what wind does when it meets a barrier it cannot break. It went up. Over the treetops, the airflow compressed, accelerated, then expanded and slowed on the other side. In the sheltered zone, 100 to 200 feet east of the tree line, the 80-mile-per-hour wind arrived as 30. 30 is not calm, but 30 does not snap wheat. The wheat behind the windbreak stood. Not every stalk the edges caught crosswind, and the rows farthest from the cedars took partial lodging. But the core of the sheltered zone, 80 acres directly downwind of the tree line, was upright, heavy-headed, and ready for the combine. The next morning, Curtis drove the county road the way every farmer drives after a storm, slowly, assessing, counting the cost. On his left, his own field lay flat and yellow, the stalks bent and broken, the heads in the dirt. On his right, Martha's wheat stood behind a line of cedars he had spent 20 years spraying on his own land. He pulled onto the shoulder. He turned off the engine. He sat in the cab and looked at the standing wheat for a long time. Then he opened the door and walked toward the fence. He crossed the ditch and stepped through the fence on the west side, the side where the cedars stood. He passed between 2 of them and put his hand on a trunk as he went through. The bark was rough under his palm, fibrous and warm from the afternoon sun, the texture of something that had spent 4 years learning to hold its ground. Martha was in the field checking rows. She saw him come through the trees. She did not walk toward him, she waited. Curtis walked into the wheat. The stalks came to his waist, heavy-headed, brushing against his jeans with the dry whisper of grain that is ready to be cut. He walked 50 rows in, 100, every stalk standing. He stopped and looked west at the cedars, 5 rows, 10 feet tall, the branches interlocked tight enough to break an 80-mile-per-hour wind into something a wheat stalk could survive. He turned and looked east across the road at his own field, flat, yellow, broken, 400 acres of wheat, lying in the dirt because there was nothing between it and the sky. He walked back to where Martha was standing. "How come yours is still standing?" Martha looked at him. She did not look at her wheat or at his. She looked at him the way you look at someone who is asking a question they already know the answer to. The cedars. Curtis was quiet. He looked at the tree line again. Then he looked down the road toward his truck, where a half-empty jug of herbicide sat behind the passenger seat, the same brand. The same chemical he had sprayed every spring for 20 years on every cedar seedling that dared to grow along his fence row. The same spray that had drifted north 2 years ago and killed 5 of Martha's trees. He stood in the wheat for a while. The wind had died to nothing, the way wind does after it has finished what it came to do. How long before they're tall enough to matter? Martha looked at the cedars. 10 feet of wood and bark and root that had started as seedlings pulled from a roadside ditch by a 69-year-old widow with a wet rag and a shovel they already are, that fall. Curtis Hamblin did not spray the cedar seedlings along his west fence row. It was the first time in 20 years. He did not announce it. He did not tell Martha. He simply drove past them with the sprayer boom raised and the nozzles closed. And the seedlings, 6 inches tall, thin as pencils, rooted in the same ditch dirt they had always grown in, stayed where they were. A third farmer on the road, the one who had lost 70% of his wheat, stopped Martha at the co-op in September. He did not mention the derecho. He did not mention Curtis. He asked where she found her seedlings. She pointed through the window at the ditch across the parking lot, where 3 cedar volunteers were growing between the gravel and the fence post. Right there, she said. They've been growing there your whole life. Franklin Roosevelt said in 1937, in the drought area, people are not afraid to use new methods to meet changes in nature and to correct mistakes of the past. A widow in Cimarron County did not think of what she did as a new method. She thought of it as a promise kept for a man who said the same thing every fall for 38 years and ran out of time before he ran out of belief. The trees they spent 40 years killing were the only thing standing between their wheat and the wind, and the woman who finally planted them was not the youngest or the strongest farmer on the road. She was the one who had listened long enough to hear what her husband had been saying and what his mother had pinned behind the feed bin and what the ditches had been growing for free the entire time. What is the one thing growing on your land that you keep cutting down? Tell us in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe, and we will see you next week.